Welcome. Today I'm talking about stenciling. In previous videos you learned about how to stencil using one stencil that perfectly fits a cookie. In this video I'm going to be advancing the discussion to more complicated stenciling, namely what I call color and pattern blocking, which is the use of one or more stencils to create a variety of colors and textures on the cookie. I love stenciling because it's a really easy way to put a pattern on a cookie without taking a lot of time piping. Some people consider it cheating. I don't, because I love the distinctive look of it. Just as a recap in terms of what I mean by simple stenciling, here I've got the base of what will be my basket cookie, which you'll learn about in another video. And I've stenciled it with a single cookie stencil that fits exactly the cookie top. That's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to do. Today we're working with royal icing, and I'm going to show you how to kind of step this up a notch, as I said, by using different stencils, not necessarily designed to fit cookies, because there are a lot of great cake stencils out there, and using portions of them to create really patterned and textural effects. So here, for instance, I've used one stencil at the base of the heart and another stencil in white to create the dots at the top. And I'm going to try to replicate this cookie here for you today. So putting that aside, I'm going to get out my heart cookie to work on. The key thing with stenciling is to make sure that you're either working with a naked cookie, one that isn't iced, or one that has been iced and thoroughly dried, because you're going to be applying a bit of pressure to the top, and you want to make sure that you don't crack through the icing as you apply the pressure. So I've got my cookie. It's also ready to go. It's been dried overnight at least, and I am working on a non-skid surface as well, because if the cookie slides around, chances are you're going to get a cruddy looking stencil. Here's the stencil I used to create the brown portion of the cookie. I'm going to put that down here. And it's nice to start with a very nice and flatly iced cookie, because the flatter the stencil lies, the less likely the icing is to slide underneath, and the cleaner looking stencil you'll get. So for color blocking, I like to think a little bit about working from the outside towards the inside of the cookie, especially if I'm working with multiple stencils, because once you lay one color down, it's important not to overlap the stencils, because the second stencil you put down won't lie flat. So I'm starting with the brown first. I think I can sneak in my white dots later from the top of the cookie quite nicely. Now for stenciling, I work with an icing of stenciling consistency, which for a cup of my thick royal icing glue, which I talk about in another video, I typically add at least a half a teaspoon of water to thin it out a bit, but it still clings nicely to the back of an offset spatula. You want to have body, and you want to apply very little. Less is more in this case. If the icing is any thicker than the thickness of the stencil, you'll create peaks when you lift up the stencil. I'm hoping the camera can see this. I like to anchor my stencil in place with a trussing needle. You can use your hand if there's handling room, but oftentimes my hands are shaky, and I feel I have a little more control actually with this trussing needle, or turkey lacer as it's called. And now I start by putting a little bit of icing on just to anchor the stencil in place, rather than doing one big swipe across the top, because I find if I do one big swipe, I'm more likely to move the stencil. I also notice that my stencil is lifting a bit here, so I'm going to change the angle of my trussing needle. It's helping to push down the stencil there, because what I want to avoid is getting icing underneath the stencil. So the flatter it sits against the cookie, the better. My final step with stenciling is to clean off the back of the offset spatula and try to do one big full swipe, so I eliminate all those track marks and take off the excess icing. I'm taking it basically down to the level of the cookie, because the more you take off, the fewer peaks and tracks you'll get when you lift the stencil off. So that looks pretty darn good. I find that I get the cleanest lift and nicest stencil if I actually anchor it on one side and then kind of peel it up. So there you have the brown part. Now I've got a lot of extra area here, but I can come in and fill nicely in with a border there. As you can see, this is the cookie that I'm going to hopefully end up matching. When a stencil's been used, it can be reused immediately if there isn't gunk on the back of it, and if the icing on the top hasn't dried completely. But once that starts happening, and that's usually every 2 stencils, you want to rinse it under low flow water and then pat it dry flat between paper towels. If you scrub the top of it, you'll ruin the stencil itself. You'll lift edges of it, and then it becomes difficult to use again and again. But we're not going to use that stencil. As I said, we're doing advanced stenciling techniques, so I'm going to show you how to combine different stencils for cool effects. And here I've got a different stencil here. I get most of my stencils, by the way, from designerstencils.com. Great array of food-safe stencils that fit cookies and don't. The last stencil I used was actually a cookie stencil. This one is designed for a larger area. Okay, so I want to get dots in here, but the thing I've got to watch out for now is the fact that this brown icing is still dry. If I had more time and I wasn't doing this on video camera, I could set this aside and come back to it later, or I could sit it in a dehydrator and accelerate the drying, but I'm going to try to do this now without disrupting that brown icing. But I want to get my dots closer to it. And so what that means is I'm going to cut back this stencil just a touch so I can sneak it in closer to the brown. I often cut my stencils, particularly if I'm working with cake stencils. Here's one I used on my baskets earlier. This was much longer, it's twice the length. I cut it in half so it would fit and lie flatter on my cookie. Okay, so down goes the white. Now the other consideration I'm giving is I want to create a central dot right here, kind of at the apex of the heart, because in order to do the white side, the other white side, I need to overlap my previous stencil, and I want to make sure it fits symmetrically around the white that I'm stenciling right now. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I've got now white stenciling icing here in this container. I'm just going to give it a stir. You'll notice with my royal icing, I always keep it covered with plastic when I'm not using it because it crusts very quickly, and that can interfere with a nice smooth icing coat. My stencil is obviously kind of leaning, it's not sitting flat to the cookie here, so I want to be careful to anchor it, particularly here where it's lifting. And I may have to change the orientation of my trussing needle as I do this. Oops, I just moved that stencil a little bit, but hopefully not dramatically. So actually I think I'm going to use my finger for this because I've got plenty of handling room. The other thing, if you're working with a dark stenciling color, you might want to mask off the edge of the stencil so you don't get a lot of icing overflowing through these areas towards the edge of the cookie. I haven't done this because it's pretty easy to get white off a darker cookie. With a darker icing, not so much. It will actually stain the cookie straight away. So again, technique is pretty much the same. Getting the icing down first. And I might go a little heavier with the white because some of the pink, the darker color underneath, will tend to show through if I go too thin. And I'm careful now to swipe away from the brown that I just stenciled because I don't want to get it on top of that. I also clean the back of my spatula quite often in between swipes because I find I get the best looking stencils that way. One last swipe here. I think I got a little bit of brown in that. Okay, that looks pretty good. And I'm going to lift off in this direction, and there I've got half of the white spots on. I did get a little bit of overflow here because I didn't mask off the edge of the stencil, and that might interfere with putting a border down later, so I'm just going to knock off the extra and let that dry. We'll come back in a second. I'm going to let this dry because in order to do the other side, I need to lay the stencil so that it overlaps that central dot, and I don't want to mess it up while the icing's wet. So I'll go back, rinse off my stencil, clean it off, and we'll finish off the other side of that heart. Hey, I'm back. My stencil's cleaned off, and I'm ready to stencil the other side of my heart. Before you lay the stencil immediately on the cookie after you've washed it off, do make sure that it's completely dry because any amount of water will dissolve the royal icing underneath and leave a little pit mark. I think mine's looking pretty good. Now, I've also let the white dry because, as you'll see, in order to get a symmetrical set of dots on the other side, I have to overlap that dot in the center. And if it were wet, I would invariably mess it up. I've also cut a little bit of the stencil off so it doesn't interfere with this dot over here. As I stencil, I like to look directly over the top of the cookie just to make sure everything is looking beautiful from the direction it will be viewed. And thinking that's looking pretty good, I'm going to use my hand this time because I think it happens to be a little more convenient here to keep that stencil flat. It'll tend to lift on the side. It has less stencil about it because I've got a lot of stencil overhanging this other side of the heart. It's sort of it's dragging down that side and lifting up the side that's on the cookie. So it's important for me to anchor it here on the cookie. Using the same white, same technique as before, just getting a little bit on top to anchor the stencil. I've got to work in around my fingers here carefully. Oops. And get all the areas covered, and then I'll go back over in one big swipe. And I am not, as I said, masking off this outer edge towards the edge of the heart because the icing's white and I can easily lift it off later without it staining the icing underneath. So for that final swipe, cleaning the back of the spatula, trying not to move the stencil, and then cleaning off as much of the extra icing as possible. I think that looks pretty decent. I think I'm going to be a little bit heavy here, but we'll see. And then to lift it off, like so. Here's what I mean. If you don't mask off the edge of the stencil, you'll get a lot of extra on the edge. But again, with white, it's really easy to knock off so that I've got a clean edge, which will allow laying of a border to happen much more easily later. Okay, so I've got the basic stencils down, both the white and the brown, and that's what I mean by color and pattern blocking using two different types of stencils. And now I'm just going to finish this cookie off using basic border techniques to arrive at something that looks more like this. I'm going to use an icing of beadwork consistency to do the brown dots around the white dots, and likewise an icing, a white icing of beadwork consistency to do the white dots on the brown. For this outline here, I use a thicker white icing that holds its shape. So let me go mix those icing consistencies for you, and then I'll come back and finish off the cookie. Hi, I'm back. I put away the stencils, and I'm ready to detail this cookie. Just one more word on stenciling before I get into the detailing. Some people, and I may have mentioned this before, consider stenciling a little bit of a cheater technique. I love it though because it allows me to get a large cookie decorated really quickly, the underlying decoration down very, very quickly, which then it gives me a little bit more time to add detail on top. So it's your call, but I think this looks pretty striking. You might even leave this cookie as it is, but I'm going to jazz it up a bit. Now I've got two different colors of icing to complete the cookie, white and brown, of two different consistencies. And I've got what I call outlining consistency to do this little zigzag border here. And I like to use a thicker icing for that so that the icing holds its shape. Typically to that 1 cup of icing glue, I'll add about a half teaspoon to 3/4 teaspoon of water just to loosen it up a touch. I'm going to put my glasses on because otherwise I cannot see this kind of detail work. So my first step is putting down that zigzag border. And to do that, again, I've got that thick icing, but I am going to open up my tip just a touch and try it out on my work surface to make sure it's flowing properly before I start. It seems pretty good. And I use a parchment cone for most of my piping. You can, of course, use a pastry bag with a very small tip if you prefer that. I find I get more control typically with a parchment cone. I can cut the opening as big or as small as I want it. I'm a little shaky today, so you'll notice my forefinger is actually steadying the tip of the bag. And for this particular border, I'm squeezing out to create a small bead and pulling back and doing that repeatedly, but on different sides of the line. And if I pushed a little bit harder, I'd create a fatter bead, but I have a pretty thin bead going here, so I'm just going to be consistent with that. And finish that off. And then to do the other side, I'll rotate the cookie because it's always easier for me to pipe towards, kind of away, kind of coming towards me so I can see the line of flow of the icing, if that makes sense. So just repeating the same process on the other side, creating a first bead, pulling back, second bead, pulling back, third bead on the other side, and so on and so forth to complete this line. And because the icing is relatively thick, I tend to pipe slower. With a thicker icing, if you move too fast, the line can break on you. So I tend to work a little more slowly when my icings are thicker. You'll see with the beadwork, which uses a loose icing, which I'm going to do next, I can move a lot more quickly. And maybe speedier decorators could move faster with the thick icing, but I happen to be kind of slow. Okay, so I've finished those two zigzag borders. I call them trailing beaded borders or zigzag borders. They look pretty good. There's no need to allow that to dry before I add the beads because the colors aren't overlapping. But if you were going to put a dark color next to a light color and they were relatively loose icings, I would suggest letting some dry time to occur in between so that the colors don't bleed into each other. But that's not the case here. So I'm going to move on to my brown. I've got that ready to go in a parchment cone, and I've barely opened up the tip because I want to do some really teeny tiny dots around the white dots. But I am using a much looser icing. If you use too thick of an icing to create dots, you'll get peaks on top of them. So this icing is more beadwork consistency, which for that cup of glue, I add about 2 to 3 teaspoons of water to loosen it up so it flows naturally into a dot on its own. So I'm just going to do a ton of dots. I've got it barely open and I'm hardly applying any pressure. I'm just touching down on the surface of the cookie to place the icing. I'm not applying any pressure. With dots, it's also nice to hold the cone as vertically as possible so that you get more of a round shape as opposed to an oblong shape. And we'll just keep going on this. I'm going to do tiny little dots around all of these white dots. Of course, you could do less or more as your style suits you. But I'm just going to keep going. And you'll notice I can pipe a little bit faster because of the consistency of this icing. I also want one big dot in the middle of each. And I can do that with the same opening on the cone, just pushing a little longer and harder. One good thing to do with dot work in general is to always, again, test on your work surface because of the flow of the icing, it's looser, and there's a greater chance of those icing dots flowing into each other once they hit the cookie. But in this case, I'm doing pretty well, so I'm just going to continue along to finish out the top of this cookie. I rotate the cookie a lot, and that's mostly to allow me some line of sight so I can see what I'm doing on the cookie. At some points, my hand starts interfering with what I'm doing. And you can see it becomes kind of mechanical. Once you've got the icing right at the necessary consistency, you can go pretty darn quickly. And of course, if you wanted to do fewer dots, you always could. And my forefingers on the tip of my cone, not applying pressure there because that would constrict the icing flow out of the bag and prevent it from coming out, but rather to steady the tip. And once I'm done with these tiny dots, I'm going to go around and just open up the tip of the cone a little bit and do some larger dots around the whole edge of the cookie. And that'll help conceal some of that white icing overflow, which you can see here that peeked out from underneath the stencil. Then we'll put on some white dots on top of the brown stencil, and it will be nearly finished. Okay, last tiny dot on. And now I'm going to open this up a touch. I want slightly bigger dots around the outer edge, especially to conceal some of this area where I have a lot of empty space. So I'm going to test it on my work surface, flowing pretty well, and I'm just going to pipe all the way around. This cookie actually has a double brown and white border, but I think I'm just going to put brown dots down on this cookie on the outside. Keep it a touch simpler. And I might have to put them a little further apart because, as you'll see, they're beginning to spread as they hit the cookie, and I don't want them flowing into each other. So I'll pace myself, maybe not push as hard because I know they're going to flow once they hit the cookie, and spread them out a touch more. So far, so good. We're just going to keep going around like so. And after a while, you'll get a rhythm down. If you're not used to doing dots or piping lots of things in succession, practice on your countertop. Get the flow of it, cadence and rhythm. The last thing I'll do is put on some white dots for detail. Maybe not that many, but on top of the brown. And we'll be pretty close to the cookie that I have finished already. Again, for dot work, I use beadwork, icing of beadwork consistency. I'm not using that thick white. I'm using something that's substantially looser. And I'm going to start with my big dots first, kind of in anchor positions on the cookie. Trying to pipe vertically here so I get more of a round shape as opposed to an oval. I was a little bit non-vertical on that first pipe. So my center dot might be a little bit wacky. I'm going to put some big dots here. I may not be doing exactly what I did on that cookie, but I'm coming pretty darn close. And then we'll do some tiny dots. Oops, tinier dots. If you make a mistake like that, here's where the trussing needle that I use to anchor the stencil comes in handy, because you can use it to scrape off a misplaced dot. And it may be that this icing is just a little too thick to get tiny dots, but no, it's doing okay. I may have just mispiped. And again, try to be vertical, helps. And over the top of the cookie to see what you're doing. I like to follow oftentimes with these dots the pattern of the stencil, and it's also easier that way because you've kind of effectively got a little tracing guide there for you. So I think that's good. So that completes the white dots. To finish this cookie off, I'm going to simply add the rose and ribbon accents. These are made with chocolate dough. The ribbons are. And the rose is made with rolled fondant. And we'll be talking in another video about how to make these simple rose and ribbon embellishments with ribbon work. This rose was formed earlier, and it's a little bit hard, as it should be. It will air dry, so you can handle it easily. But I don't need all that extra handling, all that extra stuff on the back of it. I needed it for handling to shape it, but for purposes of putting it on the cookie, I want it a little flatter. So I'm just using my scissors to kind of pare it down to size. Fits nice and flat. And normally I would add these embellishments after my border had dried. You'll notice I knocked a dot there and messed it up. So it's nice to add big chunky things that you're going to have to press into the cookie after everything's dry. But we're speeding ahead for the purposes of the video, and we're just going to anchor these on now. I use a thicker icing to anchor big heavy things. So here I'm using my white outlining icing again, and that will dry faster. The thicker the icing is, the faster it dries. It'll dry faster, and then you'll be able to lift and move this cookie and wave it around much more quickly than if you were to use an icing of beadwork consistency, for instance. So I think that looks pretty good. And then the last thing is sticking on the rose. And there you have it. Two-tone, color-blocked, and patterned stencil, along with other icing detail on top, both beadwork and outlining consistency. In my next video, I'm going to be sharing with you what I call a multi-mode form of stenciling, which involves both airbrushing and royal icing. So 2 different media will go on that cookie. Thanks!